Hey guys, it's Sam, and this is my spoiler-free review of Furyborn by Claire Legrand. This is the first book in a new YA fantasy trilogy, and it follows two main characters in two timelines in the same fantasy world. One is Raelle, who has been hiding the fact for her entire life that she has access to all 7 elemental abilities in this world. Usually people only have access to 1, but she has all 7, so when some assassins try to kill one of her best friends, who happens to be the Crown Prince, she uses her abilities to save him, but then has to go through all of these trials to prove that she might be this prophesied Sun Queen that is there to save them, but these trials are very dangerous, and she has to go through all of this to prove herself. Then, 1,000 years after that, we follow Eliana, who is a bounty hunter that is working for the Empire, which is the evil government that's in place at this time. Like I said, her story takes place 1,000 years after Raelle's story, so Raelle's story is kind of this fairy tale, and that world just doesn't feel real to Eliana. So she's been working for the Empire in order to keep her family safe, even though she knows and recognizes that the Empire and the people that work for her are not good people. And through a series of events, she has to team up with a rebel captain, and she finds out that the Empire is even more evil than she thought it was, and what is going on in her world. So first off, when we talk about the world building, like I said, there are 2 POVs, and that is really interesting because they're not really interweaving POVs, or not ones that really impact the other, but one is happening before the other, so you kind of see the after effects of one POV from another's. And it's also interesting to see this world in 2 different timelines, because you can still feel that thread and that continuity of how it's the same world, but it feels different enough, and you see how the events of one kind of impacted the other and all of that, which is really fun. I also really like the magic system in here. There are 7 different types of elemental magic, and each one is tied to a particular saint who had control of that specific element, and I love that kind of thing. It really speaks to me. Whenever you have religions tied in with magic, it's just something I really like. And there's also all these tales of these saints when they were fighting in the angelic wars, because before any of these timelines there was that kind of thing going on. So you have all these stories and all these myths around these saints, and I just love all of that. And like I just mentioned, there are angels in here, and I wasn't expecting that really whatsoever. There are angels, but they're not the kind of angels we're used to seeing. They're their own unique twist on angels, and there's also some other unique monsters that I really enjoyed seeing, and I think are going to get fleshed out as the series goes on. They are not as fleshed out as they could be in this book, and there are some things that just felt like a little sort of dropped in, but I think those things are going to get explored more in the rest of the series, and I'm really looking forward to that. This world also just kind of had a grimdark feel. I've never really read any books that are YA that I would consider grimdark, but this almost had that like grittier, more sinister, more violent, more on the edge type of writing and setup and stuff. So that was also an interesting thing that I wasn't really expecting, and I really enjoy that. Claire Legrand's books, she tends to do this because I read Winterspell by her, which is a polarizing read, but I enjoyed and has stuck with me, and that world has like a dark grittiness to it as well, so it's kind of her niche at this point. Next, I'm going to talk about our characters. I liked both of them, but I prefer Raelle and Raelle's story. That's the one I'm more drawn to, but as the story went on, I did get more invested in Eliana, but there's just some things about her character that I don't like quite as much. Both of them are more unlikable type characters. They're both kind of unlikable in that they make more rash and spontaneous decisions. They don't really think before they do something necessarily, and they both kind of can let their emotions get away from them, but that's something I really like about characters, especially female characters, and they're also both angry. I mean, the whole thing is Furyborn. So I really like that element. I mean, if you give me an unlikable, angry female character, I'm gonna love it. Also, there is a focus on sexuality and female sexuality within this with both of these women, and Claire Legrand also did this in Winterspell, and I found it a little more uncomfortable, and it was something that I didn't like, so when I started seeing it a bit in this, I was a little skeptical and nervous because I really didn't like how much she threw the sexuality in our faces and female sexuality, and like it was done in a more creepy way in Winterspell. In here it feels more natural and it flows more, and it also lends itself to actually well-written sex scenes and sexual situations. There's talk of birth control, there's actual on-the-page consent and talking between partners. A lot of really good stuff that I wasn't expecting from a YA. There are some more, I wouldn't call them graphic, but more like detailed, very obvious, not fade to black sex scenes in here. So if you aren't into ever reading about sexual content in your YA, then maybe steer clear of this. I wasn't expecting it, but ended up being okay with it because I felt like it was fairly well done. There's also a really compelling villain dynamic in here that I really like. I mentioned Claire Legrand's villain dynamic in my villain main character dynamic video I just made recently, so I'll link that on the screen. So I think this is something she does well, and she did it again in here, and it's just interesting. It makes her an interesting villain, and in the whole, and just the dynamics there, I really enjoy that kind of thing, and like there's a kind of villain main character connection thing going on, which is just something that speaks to me highly. I will say that I don't enjoy the male characters in here as much. There's one of them in particular in one of the timelines I just feel like wasn't done as well as he could have been done, and he kind of was wishy-washy with his like characterization. He was all over the place kind of, and again I felt that way with her first book, but I feel like she's definitely improved her writing with this book and this series and is just kind of getting better, but still has some of the same themes and stuff that I do enjoy. I don't dislike all the male characters in here, but I just find them a little bit weaker than the female characters. So there's actually a prelude in here that actually kind of tells you what happens later on in the life of one of the characters, and that's interesting because then when you're reading her perspective, you're like, okay, I already know what's gonna happen with her, but how do we get there? And like, that's a kind of interesting dynamic going on. So you kind of feel yourself sort of like knowing some of the things that are gonna happen, and you're kind of following her path and how she gets to that point. And that's interesting, but that also lends itself to some more like obvious plot twisty type things. So with some of the reveals that happen later on in the story, I feel like it's not quite a reveal because you already are told some of these things at the beginning of the story. It's pretty easy to make those connections, you know? Like, it's one of those stories. So you're kind of like, why is it taking the book so long to get to this, like, reveal when it's not revealing anything to me? Like, I already knew this, you know? I really just don't tend to like when plots do that, because I'm like, we as readers aren't stupid. Like, I get your characters don't know, but can you do something with the writing to, like, acknowledge that we know? And I know I'm not, like, that smart that I've just, like, figured it out. Like, it's pretty blatant. So, like, maybe don't take so long for your reveals in that case? I don't know. And like I mentioned before, some things just don't feel quite as fleshed out as far as, like, the world and some of the plot things. But ultimately, this is the first book in the series, and I'm just okay with it being a foundational book. And because of some of those things, I was thinking about giving it a slightly lower rating, but ultimately, I've still been thinking about this book a ton. I woke up this morning even, and was like, oh, I get to read, and I was like, no, I'm done with it. So it was one of those, like, I'm still thinking about it and it's still lingering in my mind, and I think that speaks more about the book and how much I enjoyed it than any kind of, like, technical pieces about it. So this is a really good setup for a trilogy that I think has a lot of potential. It's going to be really fantastic, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the series. I gave Furyborn 4 out of 5 stars. And I will be doing a spoilery gush on this book, so if you are interested, I will link that on the screen. So comment down below, let me know what you thought of Furyborn. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye!